Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of the Global Foresight Summit. This year is organized by the APF, the Association of Professional Futurists, the World Future Review, and Fast Forward. And we have now with us Njeri Mwagiru. Njeri is a senior futurist at the Institute for Future Research at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Her work focuses on strengthening the capabilities of individuals, the organizations, and countries in Africa to navigate complexity and uncertainty and realize long-term goals and visions. Njeri has a Master's in International Relations and holds a PhD in Business Administration. She's also the co-founder of a research and business development organization that facilitates long-term institutional partnership building. And she's today with us with a session called African Governance Futures 2063 Baseline, Best, Worst, and Surprise Case Scenario. So welcome, Njeri. We are very happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fran. And it is my pleasure to join you in these conversations on Beyond Uncertainty as part of this Global Foresight Summit for 2021. So for my presentation today, I will be discussing African Governance Futures 2063 and 4 scenarios that we developed at the Institute for Futures Research, where I am the senior futurist with a focus on African futures. And the Institute for Futures Research is located within the University of Stellenbosch Business School. The University of Stellenbosch Business School is the only currently institution offering academic programs in futures studies. So it's a pleasure to be able to share some of the research work that the IFR has done, also leveraging on this positioning of the University of Stellenbosch as unique in the futures field on the continent. So as I mentioned, I want to share a little bit with you around African governance 2063 scenarios. And I would like to welcome you now to come with me to the year 2063. And we are in the year 2063, May 25th, which is Africa Day. And we are located somewhere on the African continent, close to the celebrations and close to the events that are marking this momentous occasion, which will be 100 years since the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union since 2002, but also marking 50 years since the launch of the Agenda 2063 vision for the development and transformation of the continent. And on May 25th, 1963, I have 4 stories, 4 scenarios for your imagination to linger on for a little bit in this short presentation on African governance futures. And the first scenario is a baseline scenario of Africa United. In 2063, the agenda aspirations for a united, integrated continent have been achieved, but there remain key aspects to be addressed, including issues such as gender equity, environmental disasters and risks, and improved access to digital capabilities for Africa's populations. And yet, May 25th, Africa Day in 2063, in an Africa United scenario, is a joyous occasion where we are celebrating the politically and economically integrated continent, including the diaspora regions, We celebrate a population that is connected and efficiently governed. The assumptions behind this scenario in 2063 are, of course, that we will have overcome and maintained resilience against the challenges that we face in 2020, including the COVID-19 pandemic, but also a series of conflicts and instabilities related to uprisings and growing terror threats on the continent. Key steps that will have helped us arrive at an Africa United baseline scenario in 2063 are particularly continued uptake by governance institutions and leadership on the continent, and ratification and implementation of the relevant instruments and protocols and agreements already established within the African Union to promote good governance, peace, and security. This will be a critical step. Another important step will be embedding strategic foresight, so building on the scenario exercise in 2020. In 2063, we'll see a continuation of futures practice within the African Union and within the broader African continent across various sectors and industries. And we'll also see the enhancement and entrenchment of good governance indicators and the improvement of performance and policy outcomes. Also in 2063, another story of African governance is an Africa thriving scenario, a socially, politically, and economically united Africa, where the Agenda 2063 aspirations have been fully achieved. And we have here a one Pan-African parliament, we have here a connected diaspora, we have a strong youth population that is well educated, productively engaged, and contributing to the advancement and enhancement of African issues and African solutions to African challenges. Key features of Africa, May 25th, 2063, from an Africa thriving vantage point, is a heritage-rooted continent that has strong institutions of good governance and that has enhanced citizen engagement across the 55 states or regions of the continent at this point. We imagine that some of the political structures, for instance, the borders, might have shifted in 40 years' time to accommodate this new socially, politically, and economically united continent. Some assumptions are that we will be able to establish continent-wide leadership that is democratic and participatory, that we will have environmental conservation and have overcome the crises of climate change, and also that digitization and 4IR will have been strongly rooted to ensure a healthy and thriving continent with well-being on the basis of health advancements and technological advancements in the health field. So some key steps to arrive to an Africa thriving scenario would be the development of education, science, technology capabilities, but also inclusion, participation, and policy ownership by African citizens, and certainly continent-wide consolidation and advances utilizing technology for enhanced well-being and democratization through e-governance. And perhaps if we are in 2063 and took a wrong turn somewhere in the 2030s, having not achieved the UN SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, then on May 25th in Africa 2063 will be an Africa defeated scenario, a very sad occasion where we will see poor leadership, bad governance, and a lack of checks and balances, including neglecting the needs and demands of African citizens, and a complete breakdown of African community values being key features and steps that define an Africa in 2063. The dissolution of the African Union and continental collapse of possibilities, specifically because we see natural resources and wealth captured by an elite few, working on the basis of patronage systems and corruption, no rule of law, unmanaged crises, and ineffective and collapsed states. The assumption, of course, is that we will have unmitigated conflicts, completely unchecked by any balances within the continent currently, and also that there'll be total intervention by non-African actors. As we see the dissolution of the African Union and the increasing number of ineffective or collapsed states, we envision a scenario in 2063 where African governance is overtaken by non-African actors. And a surprise story in African governance futures for 2063. On May 25th, 321, we have a space travel, and we have an initiative where the continent is leading technological advancement into deep space, perhaps facilitating in the travel and occupation of Mars and other planets. Key features of this Africa and the governance system that will have allowed us to achieve this Africa lift-off scenario is a prosperous Africa again, but driven by youth initiative, driven by youth entrepreneurs, youth creatives, an imagination driven by youth cultural heritage that takes the continent past the Agenda 2063 aspirations to new frontiers for discovery, new frontiers for travel. We also see an Africa that's very protectionist or self-reliant with a strong social contract and therefore highly regulated international migration to the region. We imagine that some key steps for the continent to achieve an Africa lift-off scenario in 2063 will be one where the continent looks inward and depends on its own resources, its own solutions and systems towards a movement of self-reliance. And therefore, we envision that the Agenda 2063 may be achieved ahead of schedule, allowing us therefore to look further into the futures we hope to achieve, and space travel perhaps being a possibility, a priority. So let us come back now from 2063. Let's pull ourselves back to the year 2021. And let's talk a little bit about why these scenarios that I've just shared with you are important. Why are we discussing an Africa thriving, an Africa united, an Africa liftoff, or an Africa defeated scenario for 2063 on the continent? The scenarios, as I mentioned, are an initiative that are looking to expand the vision that is captured in the 7 aspirations of Agenda 2063 blueprint, which is a framework for the development and transformation of the continent. And the purpose of the scenarios was to take this vision and to add more dimensions as well as add nuance, and to think of the multiple possibilities and paths that the continent may take, as well as the challenges or opportunities the continent may face as it aspires towards these aspirations. And also keeping in mind the current priorities and strategic demands of continent's positioning in an internationally globalized world that's dealing with crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, but also international economic financial instability, as well as, of course, movements of migration and shifts in the demographics that we continue to watch and see how they will unfold. The scenarios are also important because they form part of the Africa Governance Report. And the Africa Governance Report is a publication of the African Union Assembly, which is why the Agenda 2063 document is a core vision informing the scenarios, and also why the scenarios speak to African governance within a framework of the African Union. The report reports on the Africa Governance Report, reports on the state of governance in Africa, and it's presented every 2 years. It's produced by the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is an African Union organ that oversees peer review and good governance processes across the member states of the continent. And it's also developed in collaboration with the African Governance Architecture Platform, which is a fora for all of the governance, democracy, and peace-related bodies within the AU to come together to consult, develop consensus, and prioritize their agendas. The report is developed and produced through a highly participatory and consultative process involving a broad stakeholder base from across the continent. And this is why the Africa Governance Report 2021 was particularly a pleasure to be involved in as part of the Institute for Futures research team, because we were able to engage a broad stakeholder base from across the continent and really make this a continent-wide endeavor, albeit facing some struggles with the COVID-19, as I will share with you shortly. So the Africa Governance Report 2021 is the second edition following the Africa Governance Report 2019. And as I mentioned, these reports are widely available online and also for the use of the African public, also African academia, expertise, and any international interested parties who wish to engage with the state of governance on the continent and where the continent may be going. Give a quote from the foreword, which was written by President Cyril Ramaphosa, also chairperson of the African Peer Review Mechanism. The Africa Governance Report and the African Governance Scenarios 2063 are a pioneering endeavor in many ways and are a foundation to be built upon subsequent future studies and Africa governance reports across Africa. It offers an invaluable contribution to our development and future as Africans. And the intention is that we hope to see increasing, as mentioned in one of the scenarios, increasing uptake of strategic foresight applications, futures thinking, future studies approaches in African governance. The purpose of the report is to highlight best practices for peer sharing, as well as governance constraints and challenges and recommendations for enhanced governance. It offers informative assessments, expert research and analysis that is evidence-based, but also hopes to give a balanced overview of the state of governance in the continent. A highly politicized topic, however, a balanced view in terms of inclusion of multiple perspectives and accountability and transparency to the issues being faced in Africa. The report forms part of the APRM expanded mandate, which includes monitoring and evaluation of key governance areas, but particularly, and this is where the futures perspective comes in, the expanded mandate includes tracking and implementation of UN SDGs and the Agenda 2030, as well as the AU Agenda 2063, as mentioned. The report also aims to facilitate the role of the APRM Africa Peer Review Mechanism as a tool for early warning on conflict prevention. The first AGR 2019 focused on African Union shared values and provided a baseline across 5 thematic areas and ended in 31 recommendations. With the Africa Governance Report 2021, we wanted to build on this baseline analysis and specifically, as we mentioned, expand the narrative and imaginary of governance on the continent to look at multiple future possibilities. And we took a baseline archetype for one of our scenarios, as well as a best case, worst case, and surprise. It was a highly participatory and consultative process, and I'll share a bit about that shortly. As we mentioned, it was received at the highest levels of member states of the Africa Peer Review Mechanism at the 30th Africa Peer Review Forum in 2021. And it will hopefully also be adopted by the broader Africa member states heads of government. In terms of the process that we took, we had a research team technical workshop. We also had continental reference group and multi-stakeholder forums, as well as several high-level consultations. The core data collection was via an online survey and focus group scenario building workshops that we had to hold online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. During our planning for this process, we had hoped to be able to be on the ground and engage grassroots communities and have involvement from a broad community base as well. Unfortunately, we had to shift our activities online, which of course meant some restraints and limitation in terms of participation. However, we did aim to have a strategic involvement in terms of stakeholders and participants. And we hope that this has contributed to the policy validity as well as broaden the policy discussion that was begun during the validation workshops. Just to highlight that the process was extremely consultative, participatory, representative in terms of various diversity factors from gender and youth to various sectors and industries, as well as various focus areas from law, human rights, environmental issues, economics, etc. Because we were not able to be on the ground as we had hoped, we did take an approach that focused on receiving high-level strategic input from a representative sample group who worked as experts and provided expertise from a practitioner base in key diverse areas. So prior to the beginning of the workshop, we had a lot of consultations across the governance and strategic foresight teams to ensure that we were capturing the intentions of the broad stakeholder base and ensuring that we were speaking to the participatory approach that was preferred for the report. Just to give a sense of the high-level engagement in these scenarios, as well as the consultative and participatory approach, we had an executive both from the APRM and the Africa Governance Architecture Platform, Prof. Eddie Maloka and Ambassador Salah Hamad, who really drove the process and ensured we had access to all the requisite level and inputs required to validate and ensure the relevance and policy relevance of the scenarios developed. We had support from the research leads within the APRM team, which had a really strong consultative approach in terms of engaging the member states and stakeholders in the various African countries identified to participate in the scenario building process. And from within the IFR, we also had quite a participatory and involved team as well. We had our Foresight advisory group, including the director of the Institute, a member of our African Futures Council, and Doris William, my colleague, and also our scenario building expert, our scenario planning expert at the IFR, to ensure that the process we were following was rigorous and academically sound. The core research team included myself and my colleagues who worked extremely hard trying to navigate a scenario building process online and engaging with participants who didn't always have the best internet connection and aiming to also share information around strategic foresight, scenario building, futures thinking, and I'm highly indebted to the contributions of this fantastic team. Consultative bodies that informed the AGR 2021, just to emphasize again the extent to which it was quite an involved research process and scenario building exercise, but we had an AGA reference group. So within the Africa Governance Architecture Platform under the leadership of Ambassador Salah Hamad, we had a reference group that included members from the AU Commission advisory to the chairperson, the regional economic community, some representatives from there, a representative from the Pan-African Parliament, the AU Advisory Board on Corruption, a representative from the Commission, AU Commission Strategic Planning Directorate Office, as well as the Commission's Communications Department. APRM also had an executive committee assigned to the scenario building process for the AGR 2021. It included a very hardworking and organized research coordinator and administrator, Julia Kiguru, who really kept us on calendar and ensuring that we were consulting across these bodies and gaining the consensus required. We had experts on the Agenda 2030, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as Agenda 2063 experts. We had economic and corporate governance experts, peace and security experts, as well as environmental experts. And then outside of the AU system, we had a continental reference group which pulled on academics, community members, civil society, business sector participants as well. And we had quite a diverse body of individuals within the continental reference group whose main role was to ensure that the scenario building process was consultative, was participatory, and again, maintained the rigor of the process. Just to give you some idea of the steps each of these consultative scenario bodies was involved in, as well as the research team with the broad stakeholder group. We worked hard together to confirm the focus themes and the analytical framework. It was a 2-year project, but I would say we took the first year to really build consensus on the approach, on the themes, on the participants, on the sample and case study countries to be involved, and also on the participatory processes and protocols to be followed. We also had quite rigorous data collection, and there is a supplementary report accompanying the AGR 2021 that offers more of the academic inputs and insights developed through this process. So more of the futures research data is captured in the supplementary report, which gives the findings of our online survey as well as our desktop trend analysis and intelligence gathering. multiple consultative dialogue workshops with stakeholders. As I mentioned, the team worked extremely hard to overcome the distance from online connections and ensure that we were able to have conversations that generated insights of value for the scenarios we were building. And finally, towards the end, again, a consultative process where we engaged in critical analysis and interpretation so that the compilation of the insights gathered in our intelligence gathering and in our consultations was reflective of the policy needs of the continent, but also reflective of the innovative approaches that we were hoping this governance report would trigger, culminating, of course, in the creative formulation of scenarios. And then just to wrap up, our analytical framework guided our approach in this AGR 2021 development, looking at African governance futures. And we had a normative futures lens, which used the AU shared values regime, as well as the core thematic areas of the APRM, as well as the AGA platform. And then we had an explorative futures approach, and this is where we did our trends and environmental scanning. And this is where we looked at what are key issues affecting African governance in terms of an exploratory futures approach. We also added what we call a strategic futures approach, and this was where we tried to marry the normative frame, the explorative insights with the capabilities available within the African Union organs, but also with the political will in terms of some of the recommendations that were proposed. Working group exercises were quite engaged, and we aimed to take a systems-oriented approach so that we were trying to ascertain features and characteristics of African governance futures across those 4 scenario types: best, worst, and surprise case, and looking at features from a global level, a continental level, applying a PESO framework, so continental level, but political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental aspects that might impact governance. Regional, a regional lens as well, a national lens, again, looking at the various domains from political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental. Features of local governance as well, and the state of governance institutions, and also citizen characteristics. Our working group exercises were full-day online workshops where we tried to ensure that we covered each of these points of imagining futures with our strategic stakeholder participants. So in the end, we had quite a lot of data compiled describing best case African governance futures from each of these levels. And we worked hard as a team, compile them and decide what the critical impact factors and drivers would be. And we did take a multiple factor approach. One, because of the importance of ensuring that the voices shared were reflected in the work we did as well, but also reflecting the multiple interests that were involved in this scenario building exercise, as well as reflecting the multiple issues the continent has to face simultaneously. So we took a multiple factor approach. And some critical impact factors and drivers are women and youth, and specifically looking at issues of inclusivity and rights in governance, innovation and technology, and specifically the capabilities for our institutions and leadership to be agile and to adapt to innovations that are emerging within the governance field, within the governance and technology field. Education on entrepreneurship, specifically skills and capacity and capabilities building, as you saw in the scenario speaking on Africa Thriving, Africa United, a youth population and demographic that is particularly skilled and entrepreneurial is important to realizing these futures. Mitigation and preparedness, and the sound natural resources and environmental management in the times of crisis, change, and emergencies. Infrastructure development and trade, specifically interconnectivity and industrialization. Policy regulation and rule of law, looking at issues of systems coherence and compliance, and again, looking at the continent as a whole and the 55 member African states. And finally, good governance, democracy, and security in themselves, critical impact factors and drivers, looking at leadership, participation, governance, and peace. In developing the policy implications for the scenarios, we came up with a framework that looked at what we call compass pointers. sustainers, as well as pivot points. And these policy areas, we believe, spoke to the totality of the scenarios and insights shared. And the compass pointers were those ethical and high-level value-based policy areas that could lead African governance futures. Sustainers refer to those very basic requirements for a functioning African region, for a functioning African country. And pivot points were those features within the policy where adherence and focus may pivot the continent towards best case future, and on the other hand, neglect may pivot the continent towards worst case futures. But pivot points also being possible points of innovation and disruption that could completely get us into a surprise and Africa liftoff scenario. Policy recommendations that emerged under the framework of sustainers and policy sustainers, the pointers, as well as the pivot areas, is Africa-led solutions, and we came up with 30 plus recommendations under each of these titles. But Africa-led solutions were a key recommendation to veer away from a worst-case scenario. As you might recall, the worst-case scenario is an Africa defeated, where we see non-African actors taking over African governance challenges. So a key policy recommendation was to ensure Africa-led solutions in addressing the challenges as well as opportunities that we face. Collaboration, cooperation, and communication is a key recommendation, including and continuing to pull through that participatory and consultative approach. Elections, free and fair elections, democratic elections were a very hot talking point in terms of the recommendations. Environment, institutions, peace and security. Policy, political economy, also covering some thematic areas, pulling on some of the insights that were shared through the consultative process. As I mentioned, a key intention behind the ADR 2021 was to ensure that we also shared the voices and the perspectives that were shared with us during this process. Then political leadership, rule of law, and universal rights, looking more at some of the legal frameworks as well as political will, structures, and institutions necessary to drive Africa towards preferred futures. And women and youth as key policy recommendations, as they were identified as key drivers within an African governance futures framework. Some pivot points and gaps, and where might we see policy recommendations needing to focus if we want to ensure that we're not only driving towards the Agenda 2063, but perhaps driving towards achieving the Agenda 2063 ahead of time. The intergenerational transition is a very key pivot point, and particularly youth inclusion, creating the spaces for youth inclusion, the structures for youth inclusion, but also accommodating the voice, perspective, and inputs of youth inclusion, which may be challenging in that they request us to think much more broadly than what we currently do vis-a-vis governance. Digitalization, of course, is a massive pivot point, but we have a very large digital divide on the continent with 750 million plus citizens completely disconnected. So a future of African governance in 2063 that is highly technologically capable would have to overcome this digital divide. Another big divide on the continent is diversity and equity, and this leads to issues of social discontent. And we would need to see here a pivot towards equitable access to resources and opportunities, but also a renewed social contract so that we have strong public trust and faith in our governance institutions. And finally, the green shift and sustainability to ensure that we are dealing not only with the COVID-19 and health crises, and as well as the social crises, but the very important environmental crises that we'll face, that we are facing, and that will particularly impact the continent hard. Game changers from the Africa Governance Report 2021 and Scenarios 2063. Ongoing initiatives, ongoing trends, and ongoing possible points of disruption to watch as we move into the next 40 years, into 2063. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was launched in January 2021, is pushing a strong agenda of integration and consolidation within the continent, which may see us move closer towards the Africa United, Africa Thriving scenarios. We're also seeing blockchain technology really offering some opportunities for e-governance and innovations in that direction, which would lead to decentralization. And this may have impacts and influence citizen engagement and citizen participation and involvement in governance. Participation of women and youth in terms of changing priority areas of core agendas that are driving our leadership and governance institutions on the continent. And innovation being a big game chamber, specifically if we're able to harness and utilize the shifts coming with the fourth industrial revolution, and also the digitization opportunities available as part of this shift, and the high rates of internet penetration. I mentioned we have a digital divide, but we also have high rates of internet penetration, and this could lead to innovation as a major game changer for governance on the continent. And finally, completely new economies and societies, which may be as a result of the green shifts, which we see that COVID-19 is also pushing particularly strongly. And this may change the nature and landscape of the continent in Africa. 2063, looking at African governance futures. So with these few points, sharing about the scenarios, then sharing about the importance of the scenarios within the framework of the work of the APRM, the Africa Governance Architecture Platform within the AU, sharing around the contributions of the Institute for Futures Research and the Foresight community here, contributing towards envisioning broader possibilities for African governance futures. And finally, a few points in terms of the policy implications and the pivot areas and game changers that may shift the continent in one or several of the directions discussed. Thank you very much. And I do believe that there should be some questions here. You're very welcome to put any questions that you may wish to ask in the chat, and I will try to get to them. Okay, quite a few. And thank you so much for your engagement. And I'm really pleased that you have been listening to the conversation. I see here Merle is mentioning Afro-Futopia as a viable scenario for long-term means going beneath colonial mega drivers. Absolutely, Merle. And then you begin disrupting that knowledge as power on the African continent. We can have liftoff knowing what our landing rights are. Indeed, Merle. And interesting that you raise that. We did have a lot of conversations around the Afrofuturism drive and the strong cultural and artistic approaches that are taken there. However, given the conservative and policy-oriented preferences of our partners within the APRM and the Africa Governance Architecture Platform, we decided to stick to more conventional scenario types. But thank you so much for sharing, and I will definitely look more into that. And I see an interesting comment from Osmar Coelho. The most important aspect of any future exercise is to identify what constraints and conflicts block our capacities, and what are those main constraints in Africa. Thank you, Osmar, for that comment. And I would mention that one of the learnings and lessons from the engagement with the Africa governance scenario building process was the highly politicized nature of engaging some of these strategic stakeholders. And right off the bat, one of the insights was that it's quite important, I think, for the policy conversations as well as for the political nuance to ensure we're taking a positive frame and an optimistic frame. So an approach of naming and shaming, or perhaps highlighting in particular detail what some challenges or constraints may be, was one that we were advised to perhaps deal with more on the back end. in terms of wanting to ensure that member states and the leadership are also comfortable with the ways in which we are framing the constraints faced by the continent. But as I mentioned, there is a supplementary report in addition to the Africa Governance 2021 report, and these constraints are indicated here as well as discussed in a bit more detail. Thank you, Mal. I think you make a very good point about the importance of wisdom and elderly inclusion. When I mentioned diversity aspects and factors being a core part of how we organize the participatory and consultative parts of the process, intergenerational conversation was a large part of this. So we actually had a good spread of participants from across the generations, both the elderly and the young. Unfortunately, we didn't have any children, and it was a point that was raised in one of our strategic consultation forums about whether we could involve children and how we would involve children. We decided to instead involve expertise or practitioners that work with children and that are particularly familiar with the issues of infants and children, and to therefore have a representative voice in terms of that intergenerational coverage. Yes, thanks. Some very interesting conversations here. And Mo, I also appreciate that you are prodding us to be more incisive in the conversations we're having. I'd like to mention that this is a seminal approach from within the APRM to apply a scenario planning method and to even apply foresight approaches and futures thinking in their governance work. And we are really hoping to see more uptake of this, and with that, increasing comfortability to have some of the more challenging conversations that we know this work can introduce into these spaces. And especially, as I mentioned, because the COVID-19 pandemic meant that we had to have most of our scenario exercises online, we missed the opportunity to engage at a community level and on a person-to-person, face-to-face level. And because of connectivity issues, access issues, I think that should this exercise be taken to member state level, if we see more Africa governance futures reports at member state level, at national level, at various levels within countries, maybe community level, then I hope that the conversations will begin to prod a bit more into sensitive spaces. The intention of the AGR 2021 primarily was to introduce this approach to the Africa governance community and to the African Union community as well, and to lay the groundwork in terms of sharing the value of this approach and how it can contribute to the agenda of the continent, the Agenda 2063 of the continent. And hopefully we'll see some growth, some outgrowth from this and some take up going forward. Thanks, you. I see your question there around the diaspora. We engaged with the diaspora issue in terms of there being a part of the Agenda 2063 governance futures, specifically the Africa United and the Africa Thriving scenarios. We see the diaspora as an integral part of African governance. They are currently within the policy space included as what we're calling the sixth region, although it's not a formal formal entity, but we are merging our futures, our African futures, with those of the diaspora as well. But for the AGR, for the Africa governance scenarios, we focused on the inclusion of the diaspora within African narratives. Yes. And the issue of the creative economy, thank you. I would like to share that, as I mentioned, the Africa Governance Report is released every 2 years, and there were quite a few points, including the creative economy, youth demographic in particular, as I mentioned, the children, involving children, also the use of arts and the use of technology itself in the development of the AGR. And I think the Africa Peer Review Mechanism and the AGA platform are beginning to think more creatively on building on some of these dots that the AGR 21 picked up on. And I thank you so much for those that are willing to continue this conversation. I have noted your email addresses and I will certainly reach out. It would be wonderful to connect with you and have this conversation further.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you so much, Njeri. It was an amazing presentation. It's great to have you here sharing with us your knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great to be here as well.
Thank you to everyone for watching too. We have one last minute notice. Unfortunately, Alaina is not going to be at the session now because she lost her voice yesterday. So yeah, next session will be in 40 minutes with Ruth and Peter. So please come back in 40 minutes and we'll continue with the Foresight Summit. Thank you to everyone. Bye.